everybody. My name is Adam Besso. I'm a professor of English and Southern Studies. I am here to introduce my colleague. It's just so great to have a chance
Yay,
to do
Adam.
this. It really is. Just before coming on, I got the news that in November of 1977, this center had its very first event. Was it even a center at that point? It was a gleam in man's eye on Eudora Welty. So we're coming full circle. That 77 to 22 that's a lot of years. It's great to be back and doing that. So Annette Trefzer is professor of English here at the University of Mississippi. She teaches classes in 20th century American literature. Her scholarly work is situated at 3 different disciplinary intersections. First, she does work on the intersection between Southern Studies and Native American Studies, and that led to her first book, Disturbing Indians, the Archaeology of Southern Fiction. Second, she works on the intersections between the U.S. South and the Global South. This led to a sponsored university working group and collaborative articles on topics of the Global South and a published volume of Faulkner and the Global South. It also led, or maybe it began with, I don't know, a special issue that she and Dr. McKee edited called Global Contexts, Local Literatures and New Southern Studies. And I had to read this because one of Annette's things is collaboration. She really does a lot of collaborative work, which is a great thing. It's a model for many of us. And so Katie and Annette wrote, our collaboration is its own study in globalism. One of us comes from Kentucky, the border south at best, and has always been intrigued by her family's intense identification with the region it could just as easily have pretended not to know. The other is from southern Germany, also a south of sorts, with similar significations of political conservatism, but great hospitality and Gemütlichkeit that the North apparently lacks. So that's number 2. The third sort of work is on the intersection between verbal and visual culture. I sense that sort of this is what's operative today. Annette owns a small art gallery in Water Valley. And in 2018, she curated an art exhibition with Jimmy Thomas on the 19th century painter Kate Freeman Clark for the University Museum. Annette is a co-editor of several volumes of critical essays on William Faulkner, including, and so a number of these, Faulkner's Sexualities, Faulkner and Informalism, Faulkner and Mystery, and Faulkner and the Native South. With her colleague Jay Watson, she's currently working on a new volume in the Faulkner and Yoknapatawpha Series, Faulkner, Welty, Wright, Mississippi Confluences. She's published several essays on Eudora Welty and is past president of the Eudora Welty Society. Her book, and that's the point today, Exposing Mississippi, Eudora Welty's Photographic Reflections, was published with University Press of Mississippi 2 weeks ago. How about a hand for colleague Annette Trefzer?
Thank you. So thank you, Adam, for this lovely introduction. Thank you to Katie McKee and everybody here at the center for having me talk on the special occasion of Eudora Welty's birthday today. I hope that you noticed there is birthday cake outside. And yes, and if I make it too long, stop me, because I think we need to all have some cake. So I wanted to thank you for being here today, and I want to share a little bit about what this book is about, and I'm so glad it is finally out. As you may know, a book is a lonely journey for much of the time, but it is also a journey that in the end involves a lot of other people. It involves, for instance, my graduate student, Allie Nick, who is here, over here, who has helped me with the index and has done such a really good job, and it's helped, and lots of other people have helped. So I want to get going. My talk today is called Eudora Welty's Visionary Modernity, an Archive of Places. So I want to talk about 2 things today. One, I want to talk about how special it is, actually, that Eudora Welty not just has some photographs, but how important they are, and how Eudora Welty saw. So my first part of the talk is, how did she see? What was her vision like? Why did she take these photographs? The second part is, what did she see? So, and with that, I'm looking at especially her archive of places. So I'm going to get going. Eudora Welty's 1971 publication, One Time, One Place, Mississippi in the Depression, a snapshot album, revealed an accomplished photographer and started serious critical considerations of her visual art. Welty's first photo book generated positive reviews and an invitation by the director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, John Sarkowski, the visionary curator who set the course of both photography history and appreciation in his 30-year career at MoMA. He is widely acknowledged as the curator who almost single-handedly elevated photography's status in the last half-century to that of a fine art, making his case in seminal writings and landmark exhibitions. So, for instance, prior to his invitation to Eudora Welty, some of these exhibitions include major retrospectives of the work of André Kertész, Dorothea Lange, Cartier-Bresson, Brassai, Will Brandt, Eugene Auger, and Walker Evans. Sarkowski was daring and controversial when he showed the transgressive work of Diane Arbus to a storm of criticism, presented casual street photography and documentary images for art appreciation, and staged the first color photography exhibit by a then unknown photographer from Tennessee, and that is, of course, as you know, William Eggleston. In short, he curated and canonized almost every well-known photographer that we know today. So when John Sarkowski invited Eudora Welty to the Museum of Modern Art for a lecture on her photography, this was an extraordinary recognition of her visual talent by one of the nation's foremost curators and critics of photography. Giving directions for the lecture, he wrote, "It would be good to hear you read some of these pictures, indicating what is in fact described in them, and what might be inferred from them, and what existed in the subject that is not visible in the pictures. What photography is really for is still pretty much of a mystery, even within the trade, perhaps especially within the trade." And answering Welty's worries about the quality of her photographs, he assured her, "I do hope that you will not spend time worrying about not being an expert. I know lots of photography experts. I'm even one myself. And I can therefore say authoritatively that photography is so rich, complex, and simple that no one understands it at all. For all of us, the subject is pretty much a tabula rasa." His assessment of photography, shared informally and frankly with Eudora Welty, is corroborated in his influential book, Looking at Photographs, 100 Pictures from the Collection of the Museum of Modern Art, the 1973 study that defines the history of photography as a specific disciplinary enterprise. Photography as a medium has received little serious study, he writes, and the reason is that, quote, "the commonplaceness of photography and the radical differences between it and the traditional arts has made it a refractory problem for theorists, and one that has not submitted with grace to the traditional intellectual apparatus of art historical study." In defining the history of photography, Sarkowski felt he had to look back and forth all at once because photography had grown like an untended garden, by which he meant that several generations of photographic thought have existed simultaneously. And thus, collecting photographs, he said, is filled with mysteries and contradictions and unexpected adventures. From his vantage point of the early 1970s, much remained to be discovered about photography of the 19th century, even as the medium was constantly developing in the present. He sums up by calling photography the most radical, instructive, disruptive, influential, problematic, and astonishing phenomena of the modern epoch. So, what I set out to do in my book is to show that Welty used the radical, instructive, and disruptive potential of photography as art and social commentary to offer her own unique vision of the economic, gendered, and racial history of the South. She sees the medium's influential power to intervene in conventional ways of seeing people and places in Mississippi. She was aware of the problematic dimensions of photography for propaganda and advertising, but open to new technologies of vision. And in taking exposures of Mississippi, she contributed invaluable images to the astonishing discipline of modern photography. She began photographing in Mississippi at the time when photographs first found their way into the Museum of Modern Art. The museum acquired its first photograph in April of 1930. It was a Walker Evans photograph, and opened its inaugural historic survey exhibition, Photography, 1839 to 1937, curated by the famous Beaumont Newhall, which began the museum's coherent commitment to photography. Welty published One Time, One Place in 1971. The same year, Walker Evans had his retrospective at the museum, and Depression-era photography underwent a major revaluation. As art critic Anthony Lee writes, despite the fact that Evans had been photographing for 4 decades at this point, of the 100 photographs in Sarkowski's show, nearly half were taken from an 18-month period in the mid-1930s, the moment of Evans's famous sojourn in the South. No retrospective worth its salt could have avoided them, he says. As Lee argues, in order to explain photographs' relevance to contemporary viewing audiences and in line with the museum's new artistic vision, Sarkowski presented them not primarily as social documents, but as modern works of art. So in the wake of the Walker Evans exhibition, Welty showed her own photographs taken during the Depression in the Museum of Modern Art in their lecture series, Photography, Points of View, in November of 1973. She selected 32 of her photographs from One Time, One Place, and included comments from the introduction to her book in her lecture. Now, I begin with this, with this nexus of events to highlight the national recognition of Welty's visual work and its intersections with major moments in photographic history. I also wish to emphasize that the photographs that Welty took in the 1930s and published beginning in the 1970s bracket and frame her career as a fiction writer. To say it really more simply, what comes first and what comes last is Welty's photography. So I offer this trajectory as a correction to the prevalent idea that Welty took some snapshots before she found her true calling as a fiction writer. My work treats the photographs not as a prequel to her vocation as a writer. Instead, it is invested in understanding Eudora Welty as a photographer whose art offers a passionately political vision of life in the South. So this is kind of like where this book is trending and where it's trying to hit. So first, we want to take a look at how Welty saw. What did she see? She called One Time, One Place a snapshot album. So there's this question about the snapshot. When Welty published One Time, One Place and decided to call it a snapshot album, she chose the term snapshot for images that froze her fleeting encounters with her subjects, the majority of them African Americans, snapped quickly to capture the gesture, the situation, the connection, the moment. She writes, "You have to know the moment when you see it. The human face and human body are eloquent in themselves and stubborn and wayward. And a snapshot is a moment's glimpse into what never stops moving, never ceases to express for itself something of our common human feeling. Every feeling waits upon its gesture." The snapshot, I suggest, is intimately related to the ways Welty approached her subject matter. In the 1930s, it was a fitting practice for approaching her subjects and documenting a cultural landscape that was part of a tightly controlled visual regime. So in the 30s, this was a practice. By the 1970s, it had become a fitting term by which Welty signals a directive for looking at her photographs and evaluating their aesthetic. So it changed quite a bit. By the 70s, the snapshot was a thing. So the snapshot relies on speed and the equipment's ability to preserve a moment from time's relentless progression. As Scott McGuire writes, it seems to matter little that this decisive moment, which Henri Cartier-Bresson fashioned into a complete photo ontology, is mythical. A techno-magical revelation performed by the guillotine action of the camera's shutter, which can suspend a running man over a pool of water, forever awaiting the imprint of his foot on its mirror. This stop-action function of the camera shutter brings things closer into view. As photographer Harry Callahan observes, a photograph is able to capture a moment people can't always see with their eyes. In other words, both camera technology and snapshot technique have the ability to render visible what is invisible. In this ambivalent space between recording and revelation, one finds unique possibilities that the camera has brought to the representation of history. What literally cannot be seen but is made visible with a camera assumes a crucial, I believe, ideological function in a society steeped in deeply ingrained visual habits. Thus, Welty's preference for the snapshot technique is a choice underscoring her modernity of vision and her attempt at rendering visible a sociopolitical reality that quickly and momentarily disappears in habitual ways of seeing. If the camera is a weapon, and people have claimed it is a weapon, the snapshot is a technique for transforming and defamiliarizing in a split second the familiar Mississippi world. I am not arguing that Welty's photographs were taken with the revolutionary fervor of Walker Evans and James Agee, or that they were made with the explicit agenda of creating photographs that expose socioeconomic and racial conditions that shock viewers into recognition. I am arguing, however, that Welty's snapshots, though subtle and much less overtly didactic, offer a radical readjustment to familiar ways of seeing the cultural landscape of Mississippi. Many of her photographs have more in common with street photography in the sense that they approach people and places in an open and spontaneous way. Scott Clive, who's researched street photography, writes, if documentary photography is a restabilization of being, however fortunate or unfortunate, street photography is about eventfulness, either in the subject or the eye. The street photographic eye is drawn to moments of encounter and wills poetry into existence because its motivation is not investigative clear-sightedness, but curiosity. Now, the notion of curiosity, I think, fits well with Welty's motivations for taking photographs. She says, my wish, indeed my continuing passion, would be not to point the finger in judgment, but to part a curtain, that invisible shadow that falls between people, that veil of indifference to each other's presence, each other's wonder, each other's human plight. The philosophy of the decisive moment and the camera's quick shutter action are integral to candid photography, and such as the snapshot. The quick snapshot has the capacity, as I mentioned, to make the invisible interaction visible and thus has revolutionized how we see. Barbara McKenzie, in writing about Eudora Welty early on in the 1970s, said, most people see and value only what the pictorial conventions of their time are calculated to show them. And she concludes that the snapshot's influence is distinctly anti-establishment. Extending Mackenzie's claim that Welty was simply ahead of her time, I propose that the snapshot is her preferred technique and term because it links her photography to a modern photographic aesthetic. So this is the thing about how she sees and why she takes so-called snapshots. Now for what she takes a look at, what does she see? Many scholars who have studied Eudora Welty's photographs before have really loved her photographs of people. So there is Harriet Pollack and Suzanne Mars and Pearl McHaney and Carrie Watson and other scholars that I highly treasure and value, but they've been really attracted to studying her photography of people. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at her photography of places. And so Welty's photographic archive of places comprises all sorts of Mississippi landscapes. These photographs of institutional buildings, leisure spaces, memorials, and markers, I believe, are understudied. Welty's understudied photographic archive of places includes many photographs of the architectural landmarks and institutional landscapes of Jackson and its surrounding towns. So she has photos of Jackson State Houses, the State Insane Hospital, the Governor's Mansion, Livingston Park, Old Confederate Park, the First National Bank, the courthouses in Canton and Pontotoc, Raymond and Vicksburg, the Cottonseed Mill in Jackson and the Cotton Exchange in Vicksburg, and many other places, of course. Welty trains her lens on political, economic, and institutional spaces in her photographs of the 1930s. These photographs include, for instance, the old and the new state capitol in Jackson. So looking at two examples, I want to ask the following questions. How do these photographs address political representation, architectural styles and their social connotations, as well as relations between the past and the present? I want to make an argument that Welty positions herself vis-a-vis Mississippi's history and its state government to reflect on issues of social justice embedded in these public spaces. By contextualizing Welty's photographs with historical and geographical information, I show in this book that her preference for what she called seeing through the fabric of every day, that is by no means a personal vision that turns away from the political, but on the contrary, an active engagement with state power. Richard Schein defines cultural landscapes as material artifacts with traceable and documentable empirical histories and geographies. Tangible physical spaces do not merely, he says, reflect socioeconomic values, but assist in exercising them. As Henri Lefebvre, the theorist of space, suggests, state power does not primarily operate discursively, but spatially. Sovereignty, he says, implies space, and it is therefore in everyday landscapes where power achieves its concrete forms. I believe this campus knows something about how such power is manifested and how it works through our own landscape. Space naturalizes social hierarchies and economic asymmetries. Power, as you know, as Foucault said, circulates through streets, town squares, parks, buildings, including, of course, the architectural landscapes of state governments. So commenting on the ways in which the complex operations of power are manifested in geography, Patricia Jäger writes that politicized space operates as a field of opportunity for the exercise of hegemony, but it also functions as a scrim or veil concealing the relentless push of sovereign power. What is revealed and simultaneously concealed in the institutional landscapes of Mississippi is an engagement with state's power. Welty's 18 photographs expose this double play of visibility and invisibility. So, first, we're going to discuss two photographs of the state capitals in Jackson, the old capitol and the new capitol. In three photographs of the old capitol, Welty took prior to 1935, she approaches the capitol from the southern side entrance. This photograph is a side view of the three-story building taken from the Capitol Green. Welty aims her camera up at the Capitol and positions it on the right side of the photograph. The beautifully composed image shows a manicured lawn in the lower third and 5 tall trees that dominate the picture and partially hide and overshadow the Capitol behind it. The building has ornamental cornices and a simple classical triangular pediment. Welty's choice of a side view makes this massive building, you might know it, much less imposing than when photographed frontally and from a larger distance, as, say, for instance, in a popular postcard view of the old Capitol. Instead, she comes close and catches the front entrance portico from the south side. It seems almost as if this photograph is not about the Capitol building at all, but about the park-like environment with its trimmed shrubbery nosing up to the building's base. A smaller White House, which is the Standard Oil Company, is visible in the distance through the trees, and on careful examination, there is a cannon parked to the left of the front entrance. Now, Welty does not exactly choose an oblique angle, but one that makes the viewer look carefully to even recognize this otherwise unmistakably prominent government building. I was at first not sure what I was looking at. This is an archival photo. I was like, what is this? It is the Capitol. So this is not a shot of the old Capitol's dominant architectural or political position in town. On the contrary, it is almost unrecognizable in its fragmentation and intimate in its presentation. The photographic perspective to the seat of political power tells us something important about Welty's first observations. Maybe we can see here, in this unusual view of the state capitol, how she, quote, stumbled into making pictures with a camera, unquote, as she humbly writes in one writer's beginnings. But more likely, Welty's observing eye, already aware of frame, proportion, perspective, and the values of light and shade, singled out a view of the old Capitol as less central to social life, even marginal. Indeed, in Welty's later photographs of the old Capitol, it is a site where buried nostalgic longings for the antebellum past and its Confederate heroes powerfully surface. I have this part in my book where you see it draped out all in Confederate flags, like an overkill of them. But we don't have time to show that right now. So Welty walked away from the old Capitol to the new Capitol to take her state's political temperature there. How does she position herself vis-a-vis the new Capitol? In one writer's beginning, Welty recalls, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, her knowledge of the Capitol from everyday use of it as a child. I'm quoting from her. Jackson's Carnegie Library was on the same street where our house was, on the other side of the state capitol. Through the Capitol was the way to go to the library. You could glide through it on your bicycle, or even coast through on roller skates, though without family permission, unquote. The shortcut through the Capitol has the allure of playful trespassing for the young Eudora Welty. As a white child of this neighborhood, she has privilege and informal access to this place of state power, even if it's only borderline legal. Returning with the camera in her early 20s, Welty's exposures of the new Capitol constitute equally witty trespasses that link it explicitly to the politics of the Jim Crow South. So I want to highlight her visual strategies in this photograph. This one here was taken between 1935 and 1936. It's never been published before, and it shows the new Capitol in the snow, as you can see here. Like a picture postcard of the Capitol, of the new Capitol, Welty's photograph shows a large part of the front face and the dome with the golden eagle on top. In order to capture this massive building with the US flag flying from the pole on the left, Welty had to take it from a distance. The Capitol is framed by a bare winter tree in the right foreground whose branches form the canopy that fills out the top of the image and whose shadow on the snow-covered ground beautifully encapsulates the building. Because the lower front of the building is hidden behind the closer growing fir trees, the emphasis is on the dome of the Capitol, its columned balustrade, the symmetrical arrangement of the windows. The sun is shining, and the snow contributes to a glaringly bright light that creates the sharp contrasts of a stark black and white dynamic whose symbolic significance is hard to miss. Why did Welty represent the Capitol on this winter day? One answer might be, all right, you all know it doesn't snow that often in Mississippi. So perfect opportunity, I'm gonna take a snow picture. My answer, however, is, she could have chosen any other subject. My answer is that the snow-white setting of the photograph actually makes visible the white hegemony and alludes to the state's function in controlling and policing social and racial interactions. The social structures of segregation and inequality in the separate but equal era, Thaddeus Davis argues, become a physical frame and a spatial lens through which artists can examine their contemporary moment. such a spatial lens provided by Welty's camera, makes it clear that Mississippi's new capital, first occupied by James K. Vardaman and later by Theodore Bilbo, who was a proud and self-professed member of the KKK, is racially white space. So you may or may not believe this interpretation. I find it, well, compelling. I wrote it. So moving from photographs of Mississippi's institutional environment, places of authority, seemingly stable, bounded, and fixed, I want to go now to the flexible landscapes of leisure, such as the annual Mississippi State Fair. So let's see how her photographic eye works there, what she sees there. So what did Welty think of the annual State Fair? How did she see this cultural space through the lens of her camera? In my book, I analyzed Welty's photographs of the State Fair, the so-called Negro State Fair parades, and the circus, and how they document the production and consumption of leisure space. Her photographs of the circus in Midway focus on the alternative lives of circus workers, the transgressive desires of the middle-class citizens, and the politics of looking. One thing is clear. Welty enjoyed going to the State Fair when this event promised not only entertainment and relief from the small-town ennui of being grounded in Jackson during the Depression, but a stage for observation and participation. In Welty's visual archive of the attractions of the State Fair, there are, however, no photographs of acrobats or clowns in action in any circus tent. Actually, I'm taking this back. There are 3 photographs. So, and I think it's because she was really interested in photographing outside, not because the lighting situation would have provided a more challenging situation, but because I think in the circus tent at that time, there was still a lot of racial appropriation in the form of Indian acts and blackface minstrel shows that just continued at the circus at that time, and that continued to reinforce the prevailing social order. Also, seating in circuses at that time was divided along racial lines. So instead, here's my argument. Welty used the camera, not because she didn't have a flash, but because she wanted to capture the dynamics of the leisure landscape itself. She photographs the fair from an informal vantage point trained on the construction of gendered and racialized spaces. As I want to show, her photographs offer a behind-the-scenes look at the work of carnival crews. Finally, here comes a leisure space photograph. So let's take a look. The photograph, Girls for Sale on a Lost, focuses on a group of men lingering in front of a sideshow tent. An arrow with this promising advertisement points into the tent. Outside, 3 men taking a cigarette break sit on the steps of the entrance to this tent. They look directly at the photographer. All have their legs propped up on the step, and the man in the middle, sitting with his legs wide open, seems to be the most dominant of the group. The sign on the left reads, "Girls for Sale on a Lost, True Facts." Another sign spells out sex and girls and what looks like 1,000 years. Welty's group portrait of the men grinning in a pose of relaxed ownership in front of a sideshow tent commodifying women expressly addresses the gender politics of the scene with its titillating promise of sexually compromised women inside the tent. In contrast to male ownership of public space, the women's public invisibility lures the spectators into the semi-private viewing space of the tent where they're exhibited as a commodity. What might be the visual signs for the loss of their honor? What might be said about these exhibited women so as to brand them as sexually ruined? In addition to the for sale sign, what might be or what might signal the illusion of cheap sexual access? Is it an illusion? Welty's photograph shows the degree to which the fair environment itself is gendered and separated into an inside and outside space that is differently owned by men and women. It is an environment where many women, but especially non-white and African-American women, were marked for consumption by the fair establishment. Her photo Cotton Club is another excellent example of the Midway world where expositions of gender and race generally dominate or determine the direction of the gaze. Here, a young African-American woman is sitting by herself under a tent apron on stage in front of a venue. The lettering behind her spells out, probably Cotton Club Review. Her performance dress is short and low-cut with a skirt that falls back easily, revealing her crossed bare legs. The shot is taken slightly from below, magnifying the subject at the same time as the viewer can look up her skirt. The woman looks directly into Welty's camera. Her level gaze is arresting and creates a tone that might be suspicious, sad, confrontational, or all emotions combined. The scene is ambiguous because it is unclear whether or not she is professionally at her post, luring in spectators at the time the photograph was taken, or whether she's simply enjoying a break. However, the signs surrounding the performer attempt to assure legibility. The Cotton Club Review, one of the nation's most famous nightclubs, promises an exotic spectacle. On the Zone, the amusement section of the fair, women of all races became bearers of culture and of otherness, writes Abigail Marquin in context of the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exhibition. Print culture, such as exposition, produced newspaper publicity and guidebooks, emphasized costumes and appearances of women, often linking them to the exotic, quaint, or nostalgic. These tactics fixed the women and their cultures in place as objects to be consumed or fetishized. Welty's candid photograph, however, works against the fetishization and marketing of the Black female body. The ambiguous, informal positioning of the performer here, her inscrutable gaze, and the absence of an audience are all compositional elements that endow the woman with self-possession, mystery, and dignity. So this was in the end, or essentially a quick comment on leisure space. Attracted to informal spaces of the fair, Welty trained her lens on moments of racial and cross-cultural encounters. Her photographs show the potential of the public space to obfuscate the racial and social boundaries it is seemingly upholding. As I argue in my book, Welty's exposure of the leisure venues of the fair reveal her visual interventions, often directed against her society's hegemonic expectations. Good. So, last section, from leisure space to the space of death. Okay. Welty's persistent interest in grief, death, and rituals of mourning in her fiction is richly documented, and her photo book, Country Churchyards, offers 107 images of monuments and grave markers in Mississippi's cemeteries. As a distinct landscape, a cemetery is full of interesting markers, memorial objects, and intriguing stories. It is a landscape of spectacle, of striking visual displays, of emotion and drama, literally of life and death. It is not surprising that Welty was drawn to it from the start and that she included it in the framework of her spatial hermeneutics. Here is a place that speaks not only of what was, but displays for the future in the form of art, how the community imagined itself and desires to be remembered. Here is a complex space of social relations, racial dynamics, and gender performances in Southern history and memory. Welty's interest in Mississippi's cemeteries originated with her proximity to and familiarity with Jackson's Cemetery, Greenwood. I'm sure y'all have been there? Go there. It is a great, interesting place. She recalls, quote, "My family were not old Jackson, so I had no kin buried at Greenwood Cemetery. But I grew up near it. It was the view from the sleeping porch at our house on North Congress Street. We could look right down on it. I used to go over there and play." Her early familiarity with the cemetery as playground is a helpful metaphor for understanding her photography. From the beginning, tombs and cemeteries were included in Welty's vision of her environment, the Southern cultural landscape that she mapped and documented in her photography. During the 1930s, when public memorialization projects sought to consolidate the historical memory of the South's Confederate past, Welty sought out private monuments in honor of men, women, and children whose lives merited no monument in public space outside of the cemetery. Marking the threshold between private grief and public display, Welty's photographs of grave markers create a history of Southern community that privileges not official commemoration, but personal loss and reflection. Collectively, her photographs function as counter-memorials to an Old South nostalgia consolidated around the white planter past. By highlighting racial dynamics during Reconstruction, 19th century bourgeois gendered conventions, infant mortality, and Victorian religious attitudes no longer relevant, Welty offers images at odds with modern sentiment and the changing cemetery landscape of her own time. Her camera zooms in on these anachronistic relics expressed in melodramatic and histrionic postures of grief, not to embrace a sacred Southern space, but to reveal an affective landscape of pathos and play. She chooses her objects with an eye towards the arresting, clever, and even the witty. So, Welty's approach to the Southern memorial landscape highlights in particular 19th century, the 19th century feminization of bereavement. Many of her photographs of grave markers offer tribute to women and children who are almost never publicly memorialized outside of cemetery space. So here we have a classic grieving woman with a beautifully sculpted wreath, and we have Daisy, which this image might strike you as being unique and wonderful, but Daisy in the half shell, or the half shell sort of grave marker, was actually a fair convention of the 19th century. It breaks my heart. It is beautiful, and it reminds me of Venus in the shell. In any case, I'm getting off script here, but so anyway, those are two sort of just images. Within the gates of old Mississippi cemeteries, Welty encountered many fine examples of sculptural work and beautiful effigies of women and children. In photographing these personal monuments to women, Welty pursues a memorial project quite different from that of the Ladies' Memorial Associations and the United Daughters of the Confederacy's attention to public monuments praising the sacrifice of women as wives and mothers. As historian Fitzhugh Brundage explains, the efforts of such women's organizations were never a private matter, but deliberately and self-consciously identified with public life. These efforts literally altered the landscape of the South by imposing, long after the Civil War, the Confederate tradition onto it in terms of shrines, monuments, parades, parks, cemeteries, plaques, and other markers. Welty's visual politics veered away from Old South nostalgia in the opposite direction. Not only was she not interested in photographing Belle Kinney's Mississippi Monument to Confederate women in front of the new state capitol in Jackson, it is still there, you can go and see it, but she derisively posed next to it, mocking its political message. Welty's pose is a humorous riff on the idea of the Southern lady, an asexual saint, and a loyal and submissive wife. As a Southern intellectual, Welty quickly dispatched with stereotypes of ladies in many of her stories and sought distance from such an environment that she, however, recorded and studied. Now, the memorials to women that Welty did photograph are counter-memorials. They're personal and commissioned by private citizens. These romantic and sentimental cemetery monuments to women are not an escape into an ahistorical terrain, but a recognition of the validity of personal cultural memory that shapes the public sphere. Barbara Ladd cogently argues for Welty's preference of everyday history over publicly formalized history, capital H. Welty is working with places and characters assumed to be lost to history. Welty's inclusion of women in everyday history is part of her interest in the cemetery, a space where women's lives are indeed recorded and immortalized. In the 19th century, these are two last images. In the 19th century, a dramatic cast of female effigies offered popular choices for expressing mourning, and Welty found excellent examples of such statuary in Mississippi cemeteries. When Welty says, quote, "Mississippi had no art except in cemeteries," she paid tribute to the great variety of sculptural work whose affective expressions ranged from the pathetic to the campy. These monuments convey a lasting visual memorial to a collective past that includes women who are so often left out of history. So here's our first dramatic example of, I'm off script. In the remaining time, I want to show that in her photographic work, female representations fall broadly into two categories. In the first, and we see an example here, are allegorical or highly symbolic representations of grief or heavenly promise. And in the second, they are thoroughly individualized, lifelike representations of the deceased. To the first. Here's our first example of a grieving woman who belongs to a standard iconography. A photograph taken in the Greenwood Cemetery of a kneeling woman on the tomb dedicated to Miss Kate S., wife of Thomas Helm, expresses profound loss and sadness. The classically robed woman is probably not a realistic representation of Miss Kate, but rather an allegorical reading of a rendering of a mourning woman. The statue kneels on one knee and supports a bowed head in her left hand. Her face is turned to the photographer, but her eyes are closed. Her robe, partially drawn over her head, envelops her round female form, but exposes her right arm and a hand that holds the wreath she brought. This figure represents a classic attitude of mourning so prevalent during the period. Welty approaches the draped figure from below, and she includes the solid pedestal base with the woman's name in the image. Thus magnified by the perspective, the sculpture occupies the lower half of the photograph, leaving the top blank space for contemplation. Variations of this classical grieving pose are found in many other beautiful female statues in Greenwood Cemetery. Second, Welty's photograph of the effigy of the woman with hair in a bun is a good example of a strong and lifelike representation. I love her. She is characterized individually and sculpted to convey her personality. Welty took the first photograph of woman with hair in a bun at an unidentified location with her Recomar camera, so this means between 1935 and 1936. And because she loved it too so much, she returned later to make 3 more exposures with her Rolleiflex. 2 images of her are included in country churchyards. In the first, she approaches the figure from behind, exposing the broad back and solid form of a woman whose long draped shawl gives her a hefty magnitude. Her elbows are angled and the garment falls in smooth folds around her. We see her elaborately braided hair pulled together in a firm bun. This detail, what Roland Barthes calls the punctum of the photograph, pricks the viewer. A stone coiffure so beautifully done is a quirky private detail pointing to the woman's sense of self-representation as orderly, stern, motherly, or bourgeois. The stately figure cannot be overlooked standing on a brick pedestal, not a professional footing, giving her extra height as she looks toward the iron fence enclosure of a family plot, not her own. By taking the photograph from behind the statue, Welty positions the viewer to share her view of the graves in the background. The large female statue in the foreground dwarfs the humble frame houses on the edge of the cemetery. She stands alone in a grassy space away from a cluster of stelae, tablets, and urns in the distance. It is almost as if she is just arriving, a living woman, not yet having found her place among the dead. So Welty saw in the cemetery real-life figures in stone standing there for decades in the same spot, in the same clothes, and in poses in which they had been sculpted. Figures on a stage forever immobilized, not to say petrified, they commemorate not the dead, but the living women. Welty was fascinated with the affective richness of a cemetery landscape that had drastically changed in the 100 years since the establishment of Greenwood Cemetery in Jackson. Representations of death and memorial aesthetics, as we know, change. From the turn of the century to 1939, for instance, Montgomery Ward offered a mail order catalog for tombstones, And such mass production replaced the itinerant sculptors who chiseled these monuments in the 19th century. When Welty took her photographs in the 1930s, such as this one, new memorial parks with easy-to-mow lawns had replaced the theatrical spiritual space of the older cemeteries. So, conclusion. I know we don't have time left, and we want to have some cake. So the term cultural landscape, and this is what I was trying to do in this book. I'm looking at what are these cultural landscapes. The term cultural landscape gained popularity post-World War II at a time when Welty published her essays, Notes on River Country in 1944, and Place and Fiction, 1955. Based on Welty's well-known writing on place, I wanted to trace her visual sense of place to explore the contextual and historical meanings that saturate her photographic representations of Southern cultural landscapes. As we have seen, Welty's photographs of the built environment include structures of civic government and social organization, the leisure landscapes of the state fair, and the memorial landscapes of Mississippi's cemeteries. Comprising the largest part of Welty's total photographic archive, the Mississippi photographs go well beyond documenting a historical reality. These photographs, I try to argue, intervene in customary constructions of Southern space and in location-specific politics. All righty, that's the conclusion.